All right, great to have you all here today, you brave souls coming out on this nasty weather day. But where else would you rather be? Sitting in a nice cozy sisterhood hall with a cup of coffee and good company? Well, I don't know about that. But that's right. Well, that's what my wife said to somebody yesterday. Here is the best husband I've ever had. And she doesn't come from the tradition of Henry VIII. Don't worry. Anyway, on that note, talking about family relationships, it's a great segue. So let me ask you this question. We're starting with the Joseph saga. I'll try to turn this so you don't see the side of my head profile. Look at me all the time. So we begin the Joseph saga today, even though we've already read of his birth in a couple of weeks ago in Parashah Vayetze. And there's this pivotal event, of course, that takes place as a result of the challenging relationship between Joseph and his various siblings. And we have a phrase that we often talk about, that the brothers sold Joseph. So if you want to turn to the beginning of Parashat Vayeshev, you can find that on page 226. And I'm going to ask you a question, either off the top of your head, or if you want to take a look and read the text, because the events are in the first few pages. Who sold Joseph? Who sold Joseph? Okay, his brothers sold him. The family sold him, right. Okay, who else? Reuven.
He sold himself.
A few brothers did it. He sold himself. Okay, so what I'm going to ask you to do is, I'm going to ask you to turn to page 229. We'll skip the event where Joseph is told by some stranger that his brothers have gone to Dotan. Let's pick it up at verse 18 and read from verse 18 to yourselves for a moment. Actually, no, I got a better idea. Before we read that, we're going to watch something on the screen. So it's just a little complicated. Doing it hybrid. So just give me a second here to get things set up properly. Those of you who are on Zoom and those of you who are here, let me just make sure I do this right. Okay. So those of you at home, let me know when something else comes up on the screen, okay? Make sure I share the screen here. So is there something on screen there that you can see? Yeah, great. Okay, give me 1 second now. What's going on here? Just a second. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so when I put it on, those of you at home, let me know that you can hear it. I'll apologize to those of you who are in person. The sound may not be great, but it should be okay. The beginning is very soft, but okay, let's get going here. Can you hear it home?
What do we do now?
Wait, let's go to the beginning. Throw him in the field.
What do we do now? Are we just going to leave him down there? What are we going to tell Father? We'll think of something.
Somebody! Please!
Let's just get out of here.
Maybe he can dream his way out.
Don't leave me here alone! I knew you'd come back. You think this is funny? Well, Father won't be laughing when he hears... Who are you?
Get him.
Hey! Hey! What are you doing? Ow! Let me go! You don't understand. I'm from the house of Jacob.
A little scrawny, isn't he? It's hard to tell with that pretty coat on.
No, don't take my...
Get up. Looks like he's never worked a day in his life.
That'll change.
My brothers will come for me. Judah! Simeon! Levi! Please help me!
We're right here.
Judah. I told you they'd come for me.
As agreed. 20 pieces of silver.
Judah, why did he... No. Help me. Levi, please. Issachar. Simeon. Stop them. Judah. Judah, help me, please. Please! Judah, please!
Judah, we can't turn back now. We've gone too far.
Ow! I'm your brother! I'm your brother!
Half-brother.
Oh, interesting.
Hi, again, I apologize for the sound. I know this is far from my window. Okay, we'll leave them on the screen for a second. All right. So, who sold Joseph? Okay, so the suggestion is the brothers. The brothers.
Except for one, no, not all. There was one who needed, with the children stuff, is with that, you know, it was Joseph.
Okay, so let's, before we go to the text, Barb, I'm going to share my screen with you one more time, this time without sound, so it won't be an issue. And sorry, just 1 second. You'll at home, you'll let me know if it comes up on the screen. Okay. Just give me a thumbs up, Sue-Ann or Anna, when you can see what's on the screen. Perfect. Okay. So let's look at some ways that this event, and this is a tiny sampling, of course, at the way this event has been portrayed in art throughout the ages. All right, so you can identify Joseph here, of course, and the brothers, and there's somebody else here. Looks like a merchant counting out money. All right, let's try another photo, another picture. Okay, so here there's some exchange of money again. Joseph looks a little more distraught here. Okay, and here's one who has Joseph, at least in some multicolored coat. All right. So what's common to all these pictures? All these money, there's some exchange of money. Okay. So when I looked up on Google, who sold Joseph? So the answer was, in big letters, his brothers, according to 3 sources. So now what I'm going to ask you to do is now I want you to take a look at the text. So we're going to go to chapter 37. I want you to read from verse 18 and read till verse 28. Just verses 18 through 28. And then I want you to tell me who sold Joseph based on that. So by the way, the clip you saw was from what? You know what film that's from? Joseph King of Dreams. Who's the producer for that?
That's not the one they took Joseph.
It was Spielberg with okay. So just keep that in mind as well. Okay, take a look at those 11 verses, verses 18 through 28. Read it slowly, carefully, and tell me who sold Joseph.
Not Reuben.
Well, no, wait. Read them. Let the people have a chance to read first. Don't shout out anything. Don't read it first. Give people a chance, and then I'll ask it. Don't shout out answers. Okay. Now, everyone had a chance to read it? Okay, let's just go around the room. No explanations. Just tell me from what you understand, starting with John. Who sold Joseph?
It says it's the brothers, but Judah tried to save his
No. Tell me who sold them. Who sold them? No explanations. The brothers. Okay, Cliff. Brothers.
Midianites.
The Midianites.
Judah.
The brothers. Okay, so we have wonderfully a variety of responses. So let's take a look at some of the verses together now. So at the beginning, verse 18, it says, they saw him from far, and before he came close to them, they conspired to kill him. The plan was to kill him. Whose idea that was, it doesn't quite say, but it says they, the brothers, already seen from afar, they had some conspiracy in mind. And then Reuben decides that this is a little excessive, tries to save them. He says, let us not take his life, shed no blood, cast him into the pit. And then after the quote, intending to save him from them and restore him to his father. So Reuben's plan was throw him in the pit, maybe let the brothers cool down a little bit, or maybe get them off, get them drunk, who knows? And at some point he would pull him out of the pit and rescue him. Okay. So what they do is, according to Reuben's plan, they stripped him of his tunic, etc. They took him and cast him into the pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. And it's interesting. Because of course, this is a bit of on a tangent. We learn, that pit's a little exaggerated, but we learn a little bit about water management and geography from these little incidents. So we know that water from rain was not a very common event in that part of the country. So they built pits, cut them out of stone sometimes, and stored water during the rains, so they would have that water available. So it may have been in a drought, so there was no water in that pit. One of the Midrashim commentators, medieval commentary, says there was no water in it, but there were scorpions. So if you noticed, there's a scorpion that lands on his shoulder. So where does that come from? It's not out of nowhere. So Spielberg or his advisors or whatever, they must have been sufficiently familiar with the Midrash in order perhaps to put specifically scorpions in that pit, because that's what we learned from a Midrash, Genesis Rabbah, it's called, a commentary on Genesis. Anyway, so sometimes these biblical films, you have to really take a careful look and see where they get their information from, and see if some of it is simply fantasy, things they want to put into for popular appeal, or if it's based on some kind of textual reference, even if not in the Bible itself, but possibly from Midrashim or commentary. So that scorpion, I don't know for a fact if they based it on the Midrash. They may have just said, well, there's scorpions in the desert, let's just throw a scorpion in there. It might be an interesting question to ask whoever was responsible for that scene, why did you put a scorpion in there? It would be lovely to hear, oh, I happened to read in Breshit Rabbah that it mentions there were scorpions in it. I'm not sure if that's the case. Anyway, a little aside, just because the scorpion would have potentially, it doesn't say that in the Midrash. It just mentions whether they knew. It doesn't mention in the Midrash that the brothers intentionally put him there because there was no water, but there were scorpions. But it just mentions that there were scorpions. So that's a good point. That could very well be. Okay, so he's languishing in the pit. They go to have a feast and relax and have a meal. They saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilad, etc. Then Judah said to the brothers, what do we gain by killing our brother and covering up his blood? Of course, Judah is not aware of Reuven's plan. He has no idea. What Reuven said is in quotes, supposedly. It doesn't show quotes in the Torah text, but it's clear certain element Reuven said to his brothers, and the other he thought to himself, I'm going to come back in order to save him and rescue him from his brothers, because they wouldn't be saying that in the third person if he was still talking to his brothers. But he's thinking to himself. Judah has no idea about Reuven's plan. He assumes they're thrown in the pit and they're going to come back and kill him later. So Judah comes up and says, let's not kill him. After all, he's our brother. And why should we have this blood stain on us? And they agreed. Interestingly, maybe after they've eaten, had something to drink, they were a little more relaxed. Their anger was somewhat calm. So he says, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites, but let us not do away with him ourselves. So his plan, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites, Judah's plan. His brothers agreed. They're talking. They're probably not right beside the pit. I'll ask you maybe an odd question. Why might they not have been right beside the pit when they went to eat? Well, scorpions are in the pit. They're not going to come out of the pit. Why would the brothers? Think about it from a psychological point of view. Okay. If they're brothers in the pit, what is he going to sit there playing video games on his cell phone? No, he's going to be screaming out and crying. Do you think they want to be disturbed during their meal after they've thrown him into the pit? No, they want to get away from him. So they're probably nowhere near the pit, certainly out of vocal range, I would imagine. No, I'm just surmising.
Sorry to interrupt. It's our first time here.
You're headed in the right direction. You're even as you're speaking, you're going in the right direction. Watch out for the pits. Okay. So I would imagine that they would be nowhere near that pit. They don't want to hear their brother, whether out of guilt or they don't want to be bothered by it. And certainly, if you think about it, even perhaps the harshest of tormentors might not be in any way influenced by the cries of the person they're torturing. But often it's unbearable to hear the cries of somebody being tortured or somebody in anguish, somebody fearful. You don't want to hear that. That's not good for your psyche. So you're going to avoid that. They probably moved fairly distant from the pit. And why is that important? I think because what does it say next? When Midianite traders passed by, they pulled Joseph up out of the pit. Who's they? Who's they?
Sorry, guys, is this 20 Danby?
No.
What? I'm not supposed to in a city. She said
It's probably the synagogue next door. So if you go out this door here, go out the main door, walk all the way to the right towards the fence. There's a synagogue just on the other side.
so I parked over there in a parking lot. Is that okay?
That's fine. You can leave it there in the meantime.
So we're not at we're at the next door.
There's another synagogue, not next door, but on the other side of the fence, Petach Tikva. That may be it. Although I don't.
Can I walk with you?
Yeah, sure. It's 2 minutes. 2 minutes.
So I just walk around the building and there's another synagogue?
Just if you go out the main entrance, turn right, go to the far end of the parking lot. There's a fence, a gap in the fence. Just walk through that gap. There's another synagogue just on past that. You can leave your car in the parking lot.
School bus. 2 hours. $5.
Oh, okay. As the brothers discovered, you never know who's going to come by when you're in the middle of a situation. So here, the Midianites come by. The Midianites, when they say they, it makes no sense that if you're talking about the Midianites, you're not going to go back and refer to the brothers who are probably nowhere near the pit. The they must be referring to the Midianites. They pulled him out of the pit, and they sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites who brought Joseph to Egypt. So I would say from the text, at least until here, until verse 28, it's quite clear the brothers, whether Reuven or Judah, had all sorts of plans. The brothers as a group, let's kill them. They're not thinking constructively. Reuven, the eldest, Judah, perhaps the more mature, or maturing at least, they have other types of plans to try to save their brother, a little more perhaps clever, and considering the situation they're in with regards to their brother's anger, they're trying to come up with another plan. But they're not there. They're sitting, talking, eating somewhere off in the distance where they can't hear what's going on by the pit and probably can't see either. Not that there's a lot in the desert where they can hide, but there are trees, there are places you can be without necessarily seeing something going on elsewhere. So it's most likely, just simply based on the text, the brothers were not aware of all this whole transaction going on. All those paintings are based on not the most careful reading of the text. I would say it's relatively clear that it's not the brothers who sold it, but it's those Midianites who pulled him out. They sold to the Ishmaelites, and the Ishmaelites took Joseph to Egypt, and we'll take a look at what happens when it gets to Egypt. There's a little confusion about that as well. Does that make sense? There's exchange of money. The Midianites, who accepted the money?
Brothers.
You're basing yourself on the paintings, on the film? In the text here, who got the 20 pieces of silver? No, they sold. The Midianites got lucky. They find this slave there, as in the film, and they sold to the Ishmaelites. The film, unfortunately, shows the Midianites paying the money to the brothers, but that's not what it says in the text. That's not what it says in the text. So, and why do I bring this up? And why are those paintings and the film of great significance in terms of our relations with Christians? What's the connection there? Because if you recall, one of the most dramatic events in the New Testament is when Judas accepts pieces of silver to let the police, so to speak, know where Jesus is and they come and arrest him in the Garden of Gethsemane, down at the base of Mount of Olives. He is paid pieces of silver to betray Jesus. And what is their reference and criticism of Jews in general? Often, not everywhere, and this, I'm not talking about today, but in ancient times, they would say, just like Joseph sold his own brothers, Judas, supposedly one of the disciples of Jesus, sells his master for pieces of silver. Unlike the brothers who go on living their lives, what does Judas do out of remorse afterwards? He hangs himself on a tree. Yeah, Judas. I'm talking about in the New Testament, not in here. Not here, not in Judas. Yeah, Judas. Whether they, so that's a whole question itself. Who is accountable for what happens to Joseph? So it's easy to say the brothers, they threw him in the pit where he was open to the Midianites coming by and pulling him out and saying, so there's no question the brothers have an involvement here. Whether you can say that they are fully responsible, that's for you to decide how you attribute accountability and responsibility for different acts, and where do we draw the line between who is fully responsible, who's partially responsible, and how do you determine that? But there's no question they play a part in this. It's like any incident. People say it's not my fault, but usually everyone has some kind of part in some situation, whatever that part is, whether it's 1% or 90%. You have to be able to acknowledge that you have some part. It's clear that the brothers have a part in what occurs here. There's no question about that. Whether you can blame them that Midianites just happened to come by and Ishmaelites just happened to be there to purchase him when they were off eating and relaxing, that's for you to decide. But what happens after that? Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit. He rent his clothes. But the Ishmaelites, they're gone. Joseph's gone. There's no dialogue between Joseph and his brothers once he's in the pit. They're out of the picture, according to the Genesis text, until they meet up with him again in Egypt years later. Okay, so if we were to have a class on responsibility, we could certainly explore all that, and that's certainly worthwhile exploring. You can try to attribute responsibility not just to Jacob, but why does Jacob act the way he does? What influenced Jacob that forced him to be indifferent or negligent in terms of dealing with the dynamics between his children? But we know from the earlier events, right at the beginning, what does it say? Like 10 verses earlier, it says in verse 11, 7 verses earlier, when Joseph tells this final dream about the stars, the sun and the moon to his father and to his brothers, his father berated him. But what does he say? Is this dream you have dreamed? Are we to come, I and your mother and your brothers, and bow low to you to the ground? So his brothers were wrought up at him, and his father kept the matter in mind. What has kept the matter? Shamar et hadavar. He kept it in mind, but what did he do about it? He berated him, so he let out his, as I spoke this morning, he let out his anger. That may have helped him, but he does nothing to mitigate the anger and hatred that the brothers feel towards Joseph. He let it sit. It's not the first time. We read in last week's Parashah as well. His son, none other than his eldest son, Reuben, sleeps with one of his concubines. The concubine that Rachel gave him, his beloved, not the one that Leah gave him, the one that Rachel gave him. And what does he do? It doesn't say what he does. It doesn't say anything. It leaves the verse incomplete, meaning either the text was removed or the editors are trying to say something like we would have expected. Something's missing here, not because we left it out, but because Jacob left it out. Jacob didn't do anything. He didn't react, which means that all's good. You do whatever you want. You feel like dealing with this? You want to rape my concubine? You want to sell my son into slavery? All right, you know, what am I? You're going to hate my favorite son? What can I do about it? There's not a lot I can do. I'll just keep it to myself, let it stew within me. I'll die at a younger age than either my father or grandfather did, because I never knew the calmness that either of those knew. So why is Jacob like that? You can go back to the way he may have been treated, the way that Isaac and Rebekah dealt with him and the relationship between him and Esau. And you can go back the generation earlier, you know. So there's a chain of challenging family dynamics throughout Genesis. Every generation experiences that. So that question of responsibility and accountability, or at least who had a part in what happens, can be spread out not just within the same generation, but back to previous generations as well. But we won't get into that. I wanted to look at a couple of other things before we finish.
What I find interesting is that Ruth then says the boy is gone. Now, is the boy the Hebrew translation?
So what is the word in Hebrew? So look in the Hebrew. It's a good point, but it's very significant what word they choose there. So it says Hayeled. So
now what I should do, so Ruben can start taking on responsibility because
well, because he had a plan. So why do they call Joseph here? It's a good point. Why do they call him Yeled? Whereas earlier on he's referred to as Na'ar, which is a youth. Yeled is a child, Na'ar is youth. And it says quite clearly at the beginning of the Parashah, V'hu Na'ar. And there's commentary on that. What do they mean, Na'ar? Na'ar in the sense that he's obsessed with himself, with his looks. He sits there, this is in the Midrash, not in the text. He sits there fixing his hair, looking in the mirror, making sure that he is as attractive as possible. And we read about his beauty when we get to Egypt. And that's the reason why Potiphar's wife was so taken with him. But there he's referred to as Na'ar. Here is Yeled. Why would Reuven refer to him as Yeled? Why more sympathy? Why more sympathy? And why Reuven specifically? So I would say Reuven is the eldest, meaning that he perhaps, at least at this point, even though his behavior in previous parashot is nothing to write home about, he feels a responsibility as the eldest, even though it's only his half brother, as we hear in the film. But beyond that, by saying it's only a child as opposed to a youth, look at what we've done. The boy, the child, he's only a child. Yeah, he's referred to as a nar, but he's a young kid. Look what we did. Meaning he's taking upon himself, I think, he's admitting to a greater measure of guilt than had he remained a youth. A youth maybe could certainly or possibly fend for themselves a little better. They know better what they're doing. By calling him a child, he's saying the poor kid didn't know what he was doing. He may have been making fun of us, telling us dreams. What do you want? He's a kid. Look what we did. Our own brother, a child, we allowed to disappear. Who knows what his fate will be? So I think it's intentional that it changes to Yeled as opposed to the earlier Nar. This greater sense of responsibility for dealing so unjustly and inappropriately for a kid. Not just a youth, not like a teen. It's clear he was a teen. He said he was 17 years old at the beginning of the Parsha. That's not a child. But the sense of guilt he feels is brought out by that choice of words, Yeled, as opposed to Nar. So I'm glad you pointed that out. Well, he's not the youngest. Remember, there's Benjamin. He is the second. Yeah, he's young compared to the others, as you saw in the paintings. he's often portrayed, even shorter, or, without clothing, just the pants on, whatever. So anyway, so that's a good point to bring up. Let's just go to a couple of other elements. It's over 10:40. So how does actually, before we do that, I just want to look at a couple of other verses that are kind of interesting as well. So I'm asking you to turn to let's go to chapter 30, verse 36 in the same chapter. It says, the Midianites, meanwhile, sold him in Egypt to Potiphar.
Yeah, that's
so now that's a little bit of an issue, because we said the Midianites sold him to the Ishmaelites, who took him down to Egypt. And now it's saying the Midianites, meanwhile, sold him in Egypt to Potiphar. Was that the point you wanted to raise, Anna?
Yes.
Okay. So there's some kind of contradiction here. Okay. Let's turn to chapter 39. Go to chapter 39. And we'll look at verse 1. When Joseph was taken down to Egypt, a certain Egyptian, Potiphar, a courtier of Pharaoh and his chief steward, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there. So hold it. This goes back to the original one. Now it's saying it's the Ishmaelites who sold him to Potiphar. So what's going on here? We just heard initially the Midianites sold him to the Ishmaelites who took him down to Egypt. Then at the end of that incident, it says it was the Midianites who sold him to Potiphar. And now later on, when the event actually takes place, and we're going to extend that narrative, it says the Ishmaelites had brought him there and sold him to Potiphar. So we're going to go to chapter 45 now. So if you're in the Eighth Time, you can find that on page 276. So this is after Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. Okay, so listen to what Joseph has to say. V'ata al te'atzvu v'al yichar beinechem ki mechartem oti hena ki lemichya shlachani Elohim lifnechem. Now, Joseph says to his brothers, do not be distressed or reproach yourselves because you sold me hither. So Joseph is saying to his brothers, don't feel bad that you sold me to the Egyptians, to Potiphar, whoever, doesn't specify, but that you sold me. So you have these different versions of what happened, and it's very confusing. So it's quite easy, if you have some kind of theological agenda, to pick the one that makes most sense. Like Joseph would know who sold him, right? So if it's kind of confusing in the incident narrative itself, let's go to what Joseph says at the end of Sefer Bereshit. Joseph says, you sold me. You're the ones who sold me. Just like Jesus says to Judas, Judas is going to betray him and does betray him. So if you have an agenda to say something about the nature of Jews selling out their own brothers, here you have the proof. Joseph himself. Who would know better who sold him to whom? Joseph. He's the one who was sold. It's not that he was blindfolded and drugged, so he didn't know what was going on. He saw who sold him. Joseph's the one. So these differences of interpretation about the nature of the selling of Joseph is quite fascinating. And of course, in our tradition, we often try to, at the same time as we acknowledge those contradictions, we try to explain them away. So I'm going to share with you a commentary known as Chizkuni, which is found in the biblical context. Rabbi Chizkiah ben Manoach from the 13th century. So this is how he describes Joseph's. So what does he say here? While the brothers were discussing selling him to the Ishmaelites, come let us sell it to the Ishmaelites, and before the latter reached them, Midianite merchants passed by to whom the brothers sold him while he was yet in the pit, so that his weeping should not shame them. The Midianites drew him out of the pit since they had bought him. So you caught that first part? I'll read it again to make sure you're clear. This is how Chizkuni is explaining all these contradictions. While the brothers were discussing selling him to the Ishmaelites, we read that in the text, come let us sell him to the Ishmaelites. And before the latter reached them, meaning before the Ishmaelites arrived, they saw them off afar. Midianite merchants passed by to whom the brothers sold him. So they sold him while he was yet in the pit, so that his weeping would not shame them. The Midianites, as described, drew him out of the pits since they had bought him. While they were doing this, the Ishmaelites came along, and the Midianites sold him to the Ishmaelites. Then the Ishmaelites back to the Midianites, and the Midianites to Pharaoh, a total of 4 sales. The text states, however, that Potiphar bought Joseph from the Ishmaelites. Why? The tribes had sold him to the Midianites, but this sale was not recorded since it was only temporary. The Midianites sold him to the Ishmaelites, and the Ishmaelites to the Midianites. One last part. The 3rd sale was likewise not recorded, since it was concluded in haste and secrecy for fear the Midianites might retract. The Midianites sold him to Potiphar, who was suspicious, asked them for a guarantee that the transaction was legal and no one would come to reclaim him. The Midianites brought the Ishmaelites, who gave the necessary guarantee, and that is the force of the wording of the text. Potiphar bought Joseph from the hand of the Ishmaelites, since they gave him their hand or guarantee. So talk about a convoluted explanation to deal with these various contradictions. So lastly, and I'll let you go on this, lastly, and there's much more we could have fun with, but you're familiar with something called the documentary hypothesis. We've talked about it in the past years. It simply states that the Torah is made up of a number of different documents that were written at different times in different places and eventually put together by some editor at a much later period of time. Each of those documents were written with a certain agenda. So there was one of them that's known as the priestly document that was written by those who would have an interest in emphasizing the role of the priests, of sacrifices, and that's prominent in their writings. There's another one called the Yahwist, and written in the south in Judah, in the portion that was Judah around Jerusalem, etc. And that emphasizes the significance of the tribe of Judah and the monarchy much more than the priestly. And there are others as well. So I just mentioned 2 of them because each of those supposed documents emphasizes a certain agenda determined by who wrote it, who has ascendancy, priests, Judah, the 10 tribes of Israel, etc. Okay, so what they're saying is these contradictions are not so contradictions. Each one was written by a different document who didn't care about them necessarily matching with the others. For reasons, they decided to stress the Ishmaelites and the Midianites, and therefore there's no real contradiction because they're written by different sources who may have depended on an original source that was different than from either of those. And when they were put together, they weren't concerned about those contradictions. And there are a number of contradictions in different places. For example, the story of Bereshit. We have 2 accounts of the creation of the world. They're not the same. They're very different. We read about one, it's created 7 days, and then we read about something very different afterwards. Even the creation of man and woman are different in those 2 accounts. So we don't often pay attention to that. So that's just an example of how we try to explain those differences by different documents, different sources, different agendas. So lastly, and another explanation is this. The traders, Ishmaelites and Midianites, are not 2 distinctly different types of people. In the book of Judges, the Midianites were used interchangeably with Ishmaelites. It talks about Gideon. It says, then the men of Israel said to Gideon, rule over us, both you and your son, and deliver us from the hand of Midian. Yet Gideon said to them, I would request of you that each of you give me an earring from his spoil, for they had gold earrings because they were Ishmaelites. And then it refers to Midian and Ishmaelites back and forth. So what they're saying is, this explanation, there's no contradiction there. you got to be aware of what the reality was back then. You simply don't understand that. Ishmaelites and Midianites, they were just different terms used for the same people. They were all merchants. And so if one time they're referred to as Midianites and one term Ishmaelites, it's not because they're two different people. It's just because they emphasize two different identities. So for example, maybe a bit far-fetched, but if you refer to yourself as a Canadian Jew, and so in one contest, well, a Jew came by and offered me this. And then after that, oh, a Canadian came by. You're referring to the same person, but they have different identities depending on your potential association with them. So similar with this, there's no contradiction. They're the same people. You got to understand what the reality was 3,000 years ago. So why do I bring all this up? Because sometimes when we read seeming contradictions in the text, if we have an agenda, we will try to pick the one that makes sense for what our ideas, our ideology, our theology is, and perhaps ignore the others. If we're bent on making sure that we understand the integrity of the text of the Torah, because this is a traditional explanation, the last one I shared with you, we don't want there to be a sense that it was written by different people. The Torah is one text handed by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. What do you mean different people wrote different parts of it? That's nonsense. So we, these commentaries, have to make sure they maintain the integrity of the text. It's not because they're different people wrote it. It's not because the Ishmaelites and Midianites were different people. They were the same people. So there is no contradiction in the text. So when we look at the text, even something as what's seeming like banal as names for different groups of merchants that may have been involved in this, there are all sorts of different ways of looking at it. But you have to be familiar with the text in order to understand why it's being interpreted in one way and why in another. Why Christian theology wanted to associate the Jews with being deceitful and money hungry. They're always looking out for a profit or something. Here's a perfect example. Even their own brother, I'll sell my own brother, as long as I get 20 pieces of silver. It's a great example of how greedy and money-centered Jews are, if you want to interpret it that way. So, and last thing, I know you need to go. In the Quran, there's a whole surah dedicated to the prophet Joseph. And I'll just read 3 verses from it. We recount to you the best of stories. They refer to the story of Joseph in the Quran as the best of stories, the most fascinating story, not because it's a good, entertaining tale, but it has plenty to teach us about how we need to act ethically. And rather than read it to you, I'll give you a challenge. Go read Surah Yusuf, the first section that deals with the selling of Joseph. Read it and see what you think about that as another understanding of this whole narrative. So it's Surah Yusuf. Oh, yeah, you Google it. Surah Yusuf. Surah is S-U-R-H. It refers to like chapter or Parashah in the Quran. It's a division of text in the Quran. One is called Yusuf, and it's the first part, section 1 of Surah Yusuf. Read the first section or a couple of sections to get an idea of how the Muslim tradition understands what we can learn from the story of Joseph. It's a biblical name, sure. Yeah.
So when my kid asked, did God really give the Torah to Moses? Did all of it exist? Or is it all real? And I understood.
All you need to
Call where you read them. And yeah.
So no, it's a great question, and my answer. So my answer when somebody asks me that, unless I have an opportunity to really engage with them in a serious discussion, I'd say, well, according to our tradition, every one of us, even in these generations, was present at Sinai when God gave the Torah to Moses. I don't remember being there. So I don't know what happened. That's my response. but there are all sorts of different ways of understanding that revelation and where that Torah comes from. There's a whole spectrum.
All these characters really
and good for them, and that's what it's all about. Question it. Try to understand what's going on here. I'll just give you one example. I remembered when I started thinking about this, there was an episode in Time Tunnel, because I'm about being at Mount Sinai. So there's an episode in Time Tunnel that talks about, not this event, but it talks, you remember Time Tunnel from the 60s? You don't remember that show? It's this scientific experiment where they devise a time tunnel underground in the middle of the desert, and these two scientists go back in time and are caught there and go from period to period to period. And one of the periods they visit is a biblical period. It's titled The Walls of Jericho. And the scientists who are in the lab at the facility, who are able to watch everything going on a big screen, see these two guys, Doug and Tony, one of them James Darren, if you remember James Darren. Anyway, so they see these characters and they're watching the events going on. And with others, they're all historical events or prehistoric or aliens. But when it comes to the Bible, there's a fascinating discussion that goes on as they're watching it. And one says, one of the general, of course, there's all the military is always involved in these projects, says, wow, there's Joshua. This is our opportunity to see exactly what happened. He really existed. And then the scientist who's manipulating the controls, she says, well, I don't know. I've really had my doubts about what went on back then. All you've proved here by seeing this is there was some guy named Joshua back in history. Maybe we'll see what happens, but whether he brought the walls down, I don't know about that. All we see is some guy named Joshua. So that skepticism and the relation to the Bible, there's a whole spectrum of how people relate to that. Anyway, I've kept you long enough. Hope everyone has a wonderful day. Stay healthy. Good to see you, Anna and Suan. I'll let you say goodbye to everybody. So unmute yourself and say goodbye.
Hi, everybody.
have a good day.
Get home safely.
Bye. Yes.
Thank you all. Good to see you.
Same here. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.